everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I just came home from school and I decided to put on a face of makeup and just film a video. And yes, my tongue is blue. I just had a Jolly Rancher and it was amazing. So anyway, today's video is going to be a video about things I will not be buying. An anti-haul, an anti-haul. Depends how you pronounce it. It's gonna be one of those videos, but instead of doing like a big general anti-haul video, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. Instead of doing a big generalized one, I decided to do one where I specifically talk about eyeshadow palettes. Basically because eyeshadow palettes, they're the thing that I buy the most often, just because eyeshadow palettes excite me, they inspire me, and I just enjoy focusing on eyeshadow palettes when it comes to my makeup collection. So that's why I wanted to focus on eyeshadow palettes for this video. So if you want to see the things I will not be purchasing, and if you want to know why, then of course keep on watching. By the way, yes, I do have the window open because I like the fresh air, and that's why you hear all the street noise, but hopefully that will be okay for you guys. I just like my fresh air. The very first thing I want to talk about is the new Kris Jenner collaboration with Kylie Cosmetics. In general, I prefer not to get limited edition items. I've only had a few exceptions when it comes to purchasing limited edition items, and that was just because I just really loved the product, or I loved the thought or the person that produced the product, so that's why I decided to buy it. And that's the only reason I'd buy a limited edition item. Also, just the colors in this palette don't necessarily excite me, they don't inspire me, and I feel like this palette, just looking at it, it's not something I will use very often, which is why I'm just gonna give it a pass. Also, in general, I just don't trust Kylie Jenner's eyeshadow formula. Overall, I just don't trust it, so that's why I'll be giving that product a pass. Next up, ColourPop is releasing a brand new eyeshadow palette. I believe it has 16 pans and it's called the Fame eyeshadow palette. The minute I saw this, I was like, no. It's supposed to be an essential cool tone palette, and I guess looking at it, I get where they're coming from, but at the same time, I don't, because in those 16 shades, there's so many shades that look so similar to each other, and in general, when I'm looking at this palette, I can only think of creating maybe 3 looks off the top of my head, because in my opinion, this palette is essentially comprised of just a group of very similar toned eyeshadows, and for me, that's not worth buying an entire 16 pan eyeshadow palette for. In fact, that's just a little bit ludicrous in my opinion. I don't think it's a good idea. Also, I want to talk about the new e.l.f. 10 pan eyeshadow palette. It's called the Rose Gold Sunset palette, I believe. Just looking at the palette, I mean, you know I love rose gold tones. I'm wearing a little bit of rose gold myself today, but I just feel like I already am in possession of so many eyeshadow palettes with a very similar shade range to this palette. I feel like this has been done before so many times, and even though I love the e.l.f. eyeshadow formula, I especially think that they have some really great mattes, I'm just not into this palette. It just doesn't speak to me. I don't think that it's one that I would necessarily be using all the time, and that's why I think it's not worth it. I would say the same thing goes for the new Tarte collaboration that they have with this person called Aspie Novard, I believe. I haven't heard of her before, but they basically have a collaboration with her, and it features a palette that looks like it has 9 pans and a blush and a highlight. This palette reminds me so much of the Naked 3, and I'm so glad that when it came out I did not buy it, because honestly, just looking at the palette, it's pretty. It looks nice, it looks like it swatches nice as well, but I just don't feel inspired when I look at that palette. Just looking at this palette, I can't see myself creating a very big variety of looks with it, and I can only justify getting a palette, especially one from a brand like Tarte, if I can create a wide variety of looks using just this palette. Plus the blush and the highlight. I mean, I already have blushes and highlights in my collection already, and I don't think I would necessarily be using that tone of blush anyway, so in general, this palette is just not worth it for me. I don't feel drawn to it, and I just don't want it. Urban Decay has a new eyeshadow palette called the Light Beam palette, and it has 5 pans, and I'm just looking at it and I'm thinking, what the heck? And honestly, just by the looks of this, It looks like they had a meeting and just decided to throw together some colors in a palette that looked like they might work together, that looked appealing. And when I look at this palette, all I can think of is maybe just creating the same two looks with this eyeshadow palette, because you just have the most basic kinds of colors, but then you have like a random orange and then a random purple stuck in there, and it's like, how would that look good together? I mean, if you're gonna do a colorful makeup look, that's okay, but then you have like those neutral colors, and then you're expected to make an orange and a purple look good together when you just have like neutral colors to support them. I mean, when I'm talking about like 5-pan eyeshadow palettes, I feel like Dose of Colors has done a fantastic job, because when I look at it, I'm like, I can create so many different looks with it, and that's exactly what I've done. I have used this palette so much. This is becoming one of my most used palettes of the moment, at least, and it has 5 pans and it looks pretty basic. But when I look at the Urban Decay palette, I'm just looking at a palette that looks like it was thrown together without much thought behind it, and it looks like the only reason it was produced is to sell the warm tones trend, which honestly I feel like is a little bit overplayed at this point, so I don't see the point. BH Cosmetics has a new palette coming out called the NO.2 Neutrals palette, and I believe it has 27 different eyeshadows, and it looks like it also has 5 different blushes. This was a palette that I was like, should I put it in this video? Should I not put it in this video? But honestly, I don't think I'll be buying this palette, just because I feel like I have so many neutrals already. I do feel drawn to the second row from the top. That looks like a collection of pretty nice, pretty good looking eyeshadows that I would have a nice time using. However, I feel like this palette, if I did buy it, would probably remain largely unused, just because I don't feel like I'll be using a majority of these colors anyway. So if I'm getting a palette, I do want to use as much of it as possible, and when I look at this palette, all I see are shades that are very, very similar to the shades I already have in my collection, so that kind of defeats the purpose of having to buy a new palette anyway. Viseart has a new palette coming out called the Petite Pro 3, which looks like a collection of purpley eyeshadows. And while I do love my purples, I just don't think I'll be getting this. This palette looks tiny, so there's no way I want to pay $30 for a tiny palette when I could be paying less for, say, a Juvia's Place palette, which has a lot of really beautiful, colorful eyeshadow for a cheaper price than a Viseart palette, which is like $30 for a really small palette, when Juvia's Place has you paying like $20 for a palette with pretty large pan size, you know what I'm saying? So I just don't think it's worth it, and I'd rather be spending elsewhere. So next up is a palette that I think a lot of you might disagree with me on, just because this palette has gotten a lot of hype. People seem to be really liking this palette. However, I do not think as of now that I'll be purchasing this palette. Maybe that will change, I don't know, but as of now, looking at this palette, this is the Laura Lee Nudie Patootie palette. Looking at this palette, I'm like, well, I only feel drawn to 3, maybe 4 shades in this entire palette. So no matter how pretty the shades may look or how unique they are, and they look like they're pretty unique, these do look like colors that are not necessarily done as much in the beauty industry. So she did a good job in that department, but still, when I'm looking at this palette, I don't feel as inspired as I feel like I should be when I'm looking at a palette in general. Maybe this will change if I look online and if I see people using it on Instagram and on YouTube more, but as of now, I'm just not inspired by it. I definitely feel that when it comes to eyeshadow palettes, many people, myself included, but I'm trying to work on this, many people tend to look at a collection of nice, beautiful colors that seem to be really beautiful shades, and they just decide to get that palette, and they don't really know what to do with it afterwards, you know? I have so many palettes in my collection that I purchased because they looked pretty and they looked nice, but I just don't use. And now I'm actually going through my collection of palettes and I'm trying to figure out which palettes I like and which palettes I want to get rid of just because I have so many and it's kind of overwhelming. So that's what I'm working on right now, and in the future I think I'll be filming a palette declutter video where I just go through every single palette and just declutter all of that and just give it to friends, give it to family, and I feel like you guys will be seeing that in the near future. But as of now, I'm working on that. So my point is, I just feel like it's so important just to try and take a look at eyeshadow palettes, and instead of just following the hype and instead of just listening to what everyone else has to say about a product, just to consider, do you actually need it? Do you actually think you'll be using it? Do you feel inspired by it? Does it make you feel like you would pay twice the amount of money that this palette is priced at just to get it, you know? Whenever I look at a palette like, I don't know, what's sitting in front of me, the Juvia's Place Masquerade palette, this is something that was $20 when I got it, and I mean, you can't really see it because I don't tend to make really big dents in my eyeshadows, but I have used this palette so many times and I've created so many different looks with it. I mean, this palette does have 16 shades, but when I look at this palette, I feel so incredibly inspired. I have really just gone into every single color in this palette and used it at least 3 times, and I love it. I can create so many different amazing looks with this palette. I even used it on my eyes today. I used this color called Giza as an inner corner highlight, and I have been doing so countless times because I just love this little thing. So now I'm thinking that whenever I want to purchase a palette, or whenever I'm even thinking about purchasing a palette, if I look at a palette and I love it just as much as I love this palette, or some of my other favorites, if I love it just as much as I love the Dose of Colors Blushing Berries palette, then it's worth for me to actually spend the money I save on this palette. So that's just my opinion, that's just my cup of tea. So thank you guys so much for joining me till the end of this video. I would like to do more of these kinds of videos on my channel just because I feel like they're a little bit refreshing and it is nice to mix it up a little bit. So thank you guys so much for watching till the end of this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it and learned something new today, and I'll see you guys in another video. Bye guys.